Good afternoon to everyone here. And as mentioned, my name is Dave Foord. Now, I'm actually a freelancer. I've got my own company called A6 Training and Consultancy, and I support many organizations. Well, I say many, about 10, of which one is CABI. And I'll be demonstrating what CABI have done towards the end of the presentation. Now, I work pretty much now almost entirely with Moodle, and most of my clients happen to be global organizations, and as a result of that, I've had a need to support multilingual content. Now, I appreciate that not everyone in this audience will have a Moodle environment or a Moodle background, so some of the bits, especially towards the end, may not be relevant, but the journey that I've been through, and that's what I'm talking about here, some of it might be relevant if you are thinking of multilingualism in other sites. And for about the last 10 years, I've been fighting and battling to try and come up with a sustainable way of providing multilingual Moodles. Because people say, oh, can we have this in this language and that language and everything else? And I, oh, yeah, of course we can. But it becomes hard work, is the simple answer. And in the last year or so, I've finally got a solution that I am now happy with as a manageable way forwards. So the first question is, why? And especially as AI is becoming more prevalent, why don't we just leave things to AI and let it translate, and we don't have to worry about providing the content in other languages? Well, there are a few reasons. If the course or the content has a heavy legal aspect to it, the problem with AI is it doesn't always get it right. And sometimes you can change the meaning quite significantly, and that can have quite serious implications. So if the course you're teaching is a law course, or the elements of the course you're teaching has a legal aspect, then there's risks. For example, one of my clients is World Triathlon, and we have the technical officials, the equivalent of umpires or referees, and we have a load of multiple choice questions as part of their training. And I ran a set of 20 questions through sort of AI translation tools and translated it into Chinese. I then got a native Chinese speaker who had good English to then check those translations and tell me how good they were. And out of the 20, 6 were okay. I think it was about 8, or I forget exactly, either 8 or 6 were sort of okay. They changed the meaning, but it wasn't too catastrophic. But out of the 20, 6 of the questions had been changed so much that it was now factually totally incorrect. Okay, and that to me just isn't a good enough success rate. 6 out of 20 to fail catastrophically isn't good enough. If you have a subject that's quite technical, whether it's scientific or medical, or it's just a very, very niche subject where there isn't the sources of information on the internet that the AI tools can effectively learn from, then you're going to have problems with sort of the jargon not translating correctly. And again, if I use a World Triathlon example, in elite triathlon, there's a principle known as drafting. So when you're on a bike, if you ride really close to the person in front, you'll get an aerodynamic advantage, and it's called drafting. When I tried to get that translated into Spanish using the automatic tools, their understanding of the word drafting is what you do when you start composing an email. So it was translating the content to sort of say, yeah, while riding a bike at speed, it's advantageous to start writing an email. Okay, that makes no sense. And similarly, in the world of sport, which is my main background, the word coach can have 2 very specific different meanings. It could mean a person that helps you get better. It can also mean a large bus-like vehicle that takes you to the venue. And tools don't always know which version to use, and then you suddenly have weird things where you're talking about coach training and it suddenly throws in the word autobus or something. If the languages that you want to translate into are your common sort of European, Latin-esque type languages, so French, Spanish, Italian, German, then AI is reasonably okay. But if it's a lesser spoken language, and especially one that doesn't have your Latin-esque characters, so your sort of Chinese characters, Japanese characters, your Sanskrits, then the return is usually less good or less accurate. And especially if it's a not widely spoken language, there's less data for it to pull from, and as a result, you will get much higher inaccuracies and discrepancies. And then finally, Moodle as a VLE has a wonderful associated app. So for people that are learning on a mobile device, if they download the app, they can access their content. And the app will not do the translations that a browser would do. Yes, they could still access the course through their small device on the browser, but they're losing out on the benefit that the app brings. Whereas if we translate the content properly inside the course, then the app will pick it up and they can get their content in that language. So there are different approaches that we can take. And I have done all of these over the 10 years, and I will go through the advantages and disadvantages as I go through. So probably the easiest to comprehend and probably the widest used is the idea of parallel courses. So here I have a single course on underwater origami, and that is in English. I take a copy of that course and I translate that into French, and I have a parallel course that is in French. And hopefully the English students will do the English course and the French students will do the French course. And if I want to get a Spanish version, I create a Spanish version, and so on. I need to somehow demarcate which ones are which and somehow get the right learners into the right course. And this might sound silly, but that's actually where it's problematic. People often end up in the wrong course. And one of the projects I worked on a few years ago, we had quite a few languages. People would get halfway through in English, then realize that there was a Spanish version that they didn't know about. They would ask to get transferred, which is no problem, but because they were halfway through and they're going into a brand new course, they effectively had to restart the course, and they weren't very happy. And they were complaining, oh, can't you just mark me off as complete? And I actually ended up spending hours and hours having to go into the translated courses and just tick off against individuals that they'd completed it because they'd done it in the other course to start with. And that really isn't sustainable or manageable. Secondly, if you have multiple parallel courses and you need to make changes to the English, if that's your default language, it's very easy to forget about the parallel courses, and as a result, they over time go out of sync with each other. It's also, if you've got somebody who's monitoring the courses and having to sort of go in and sort of like post announcements or something, they're having to do it in 3 separate places. So you're making it more workload for the people managing, which again, it's very easy for them to send a message to the English group and forget about the other courses. And from the users, if you do have collaborative activities, let's say forum, if there's, let's say, 200 students on the English course, 50 on the French and 5 on Spanish, well, the ones on the English course are going to get a very different experience. They're going to have a much richer experience because they're talking with 200 other students, whereas the Spanish, there's only 5 of them, and there's a good chance that one person will post and the others are just lurking, and you don't even get a conversation. So there's sort of some of the issues that you will have with parallel courses. For those that are on other VLEs, this may be the only option that you have if you are doing multilingualism. But if you are a Moodle user, it is an option, but there are alternatives. So the alternative in Moodle is you can have parallel items, but in the same course. So I've not got different courses. I've got one course, but I can use what are called availability restrictions based on language. So in the example on the screen at the moment, I've got the rules of triathlon, which is in English, and then underneath it, I've got the equivalent file, but in Spanish. And if the user's profile is set that their preferred language is Spanish, they would see this second item. If their preferred language is anything other than Spanish, they would see the top item. And in this case, we've just got the 2 languages in this course. So the top 2 items are a pair, and then I've got a different set, which again are a pair. So the students will only see either the English or the Spanish, depending on their preferences. I, as the tutor, would see both. It's slightly advantageous over the parallel courses because at least everything's in the same course. If I need to come in and make a change to one of the books, I can easily see that there's another book I need to make a change to. If I had like forum activities and I hadn't split that by language, at least everybody would be in the same forum. They might have to use like the translation tools to actually understand the other languages, but you're not limiting who speaks to who and potentially having those very small groups that you might otherwise have. However, this can become quite messy. If you need to use like logic and you have to done this activity and that activity before you get your certificate, it can become quite complicated. If you start to have lots of languages within the same course, you're restriction logic becomes quite complex and quite hard to understand and unpick. Now, there are other tools. There's a plugin called Content Translations, and the people that have developed this, the plugin itself works absolutely brilliantly. There's no problem there, and I want to make sure that I'm not sort of disrespecting the people that have created the plugin. And this is actually what CABI, as one of the organisations I support, used and tried to use for a couple of years, and actually invested a lot of money into the development of this. Unfortunately, when this was developed, this plugin, there were a lot of limitations and sort of parameters that they had to work to. And unfortunately, those limitations and parameters make the actual workflow not ideal. And as a result of that, we persevered at CABI for a couple of years trying to work with it, and we've now moved away because it became, for us, unmanageable. And I think for a lot of people, you would run into the similar problems that we ran into. I don't want to go into problems now. I can answer them later in the questions if people are interested. But there were, unfortunately, quite a few problems. So what's the solution? Now in Moodle, we have what are called filters. So filters are where things appear in the text, but it then renders them in a different way. And one of the filter plugins is the mlang version 2. And the way that it works is we take some content. I've just got a single line of text, which is in English. What I would first of all do is wrap that text inside what are called mlang tags. And I've very specifically chosen mlang other. I will explain why in a second. What I can then do is I can then add the translated text. In this case, I've gone Spanish, and that is inside mlang es. So es is the 2-digit code for Spanish, as in España. And then I can add in other languages. So here I've now got 3 languages: English, Spanish, and French. So when I'm editing, I see all 3. However, when a user comes in, if the user's preferred language is French, they will see the blue text. They don't see the tags, the bits inside the curly brackets. They just see the text. So they would see Bonjour, je m'appelle Dave. If the user was Spanish, they would see the red text. And if their language was anything other than English, Spanish or French, then they would see the black text, which in this case is English. And a mistake that some people make is they would have put mlang en for the first one rather than mlang other. And the reason that's a mistake is if you had somebody who was German and they came in, if I'd set the first one to mlang en, they would see nothing because they're not English, they're not Spanish, and they're not French, and therefore they would just see nothing. So that's why you always use mlang other. So you have got a default language. So if they've got a language that's not one of the ones that you've translated, they at least see something, and then they can use the browser tools to take it further. So that's the ideal end solution. So this is how it actually looks inside one of the courses. And again, this is a CABI course, and I'm hoping you can see my mouse. So my top bit is the English bit. So I've got, so before I had a single line of text, but you can have paragraphs, whole pages, tables, everything, as long as it appears between your opening mlang and your closing mlang tag. What we then have is the same text in Bengali, and then I've got the Spanish. And I haven't quite finished the Spanish, I've just run out of screen space. But in this particular course, we've actually got 6 languages in play. Now, from a user's perspective, it's absolutely brilliant. If they're English, they see the English. If they're Spanish, they see the Spanish. They can change languages halfway through, and what they see will change accordingly. But because it's the same course and it's the same items in the course, then their completion tracking is maintained because they've still done them. It doesn't matter that they've changed languages partway through, it just maintains it. So it's really, really neat and easy. The problem is, how do we get this content in with these different languages? And that's the bit that I've been fighting with for quite a few years. I can manually copy and paste the text in from different languages and add the tags in, but it's exceptionally slow. It's not too bad for languages like Spanish and French, where I recognize the characters and I recognize enough words. But if I start trying to do it with the Bengali, I don't know which words are which ones I need to highlight in bold, which ones I need to make into subheadings, and that sort of stuff, because I've got to run each one through Google Translate myself so that I can kind of work out which one's the heading, and it's really time consuming. So ways of getting there. There is another plugin that's been developed by somebody called Bruno. He works for a Swiss university, and it makes use of the DeepL translation system. The way it works is you connect your Moodle to DeepL. DeepL's a bit like a Google Translate, but slightly better. And you run a course through the translation. It basically puts it back in, applying those mlang tags as per what I just showed you. And the beauty of this one is you then have an interface where you can come in and it will just show you on each page. You can go into the page and you can look at the translation. If you see a translation that isn't quite right, you can actually just come in and edit it in a really nice interface, and it will actually change it in the course for you. The only downside is it's a relatively new plugin. You can see there it's not been used many times. I've tried to work with it, and I've had quite a few calls to Bruno to try and get it to work. It works on their system and it works on a few people's system, but unfortunately, because of the complexity of Moodle, it doesn't appear to be working reliably on all. So at the moment, I've had to just park that one. It might come back into play, but at the moment, I've not been able to get it to work reliably enough for this to work for me. I'm hoping it comes back into play because it becomes a useful part of the process, but for the moment, it doesn't feel like it's quite there, which is a shame. And so to where I've ended up. And this is making use of an external translation company. So rather than somebody translating the content, giving it to me in a Word file and me sitting there for hours and hours trying to set it, and it costs a lot of money, I'm actually going to pay a professional translation company to do the translations for me. So CABI, who I've been working with, have worked with a translation company called Easy Globe, and they, working with me, have created a solution. I will now just come to my Moodle so that I can show you what it looks like. So I'm inside my Moodle, and this is in the admin settings. So the plugin is free. It's basically an API connection. So I come in, you put in a key and a few other bits and details. You don't have to worry too much about that. There's various options, so you can decide exactly how it's configured. But the key thing is towards the bottom is I, as the admin, have choice. I can either list which courses I want to be translatable, and I add them here, or I leave that box empty, and I then set it that any are translatable, but I can then restrict some if I don't want them to be seen by Easy Globe. So each of these numbers relates to a different course. So the way it would work is I will have a course that is in English, and I will contact Easy Globe and say, right, can you tell me how much it would cost to translate course number 170 into these languages? And make sure that 170 is added to that list so that they can then see it. They effectively take a copy of that course into their management database system, translation system. They'll work out a word count. They come back to me with a quote and say, yeah, it'll cost you this much for this language, this much for that language. And we go, yep, that's great. Off you go. They'll then deploy translators who do the actual translation. And once it's all been done, it basically, at the press of a button, they can re-inject back into the live course. I've got live students, real students accessing the course already. It just re-injects all of that text back inside the correct mlang tags, just like that. It's like magic. It's amazing. If I want to make any changes, I just need to edit the English bits of the course. I go back to Easy Globe and said, I've made some changes. Can you have a look? What they do is they effectively take another copy of the course back to their site. Now they've still got a copy of the translations they've done before, and that's still stored in that translation bank. So they can just work out what's changed. And it might be a relatively small number. Because it's a small number, it doesn't cost that much. And they'll say, oh yeah, it'll be this much money to make these changes. And I'll go, yep, off you go. So they'll make the changes. And again, they can just re-inject the code straight back in without me having to do anything. And that's basically the solution that we have come up with. And for me, it's been a game changer. It's so much easier for me to manage courses and manage the translations. Takes out a lot of the potential for errors. Yeah, it's been brilliant. I will very quickly, if anybody's interested in Easy Globe, I'll put that on the screen so that people have a chance to do that. And I will then switch to questions.